Welcome back to another Genco lesson. I hope you all are having a wonderful day. In this video, we are going to be doing loops in Python, and we're going to go into more details about it. Also, just like in the previous lesson, I'm also going to show you a little bit of a demo in PyCharm to show you how all this, what I'm going to explain in the presentation, works in a real Python interpreter. But before we go into this presentation, let me just recap our previous presentation. In the last presentation, we were discussing about conditionals. So conditionals are a big thing going into our capstone project. But now we are going to be doing another basic topic that will get us our coding much more shorter, much more efficient, and that's where the loops come in. So today we're going to be talking about loops. So let's just jump right into the presentation. So what are loops? So loops in computer science are basically repetition control structures, right? That allows a single statement or a block to be executed repeatedly. What I mean by that? So let's say I wanted to print hello world, right? We know how to print hello world. I showed you, like in the previous video, I demoed it, and it's pretty much straightforward. Just write print, the function print, parentheses, the string hello world in quotation marks, right? And when we run that code, it will just print hello world. But let's say I want to do that repeatedly, right? Let's say I want to print hello world 50 times. Instead of writing print hello world 50 times, which will probably be taking forever to do, there's something in programming we call it's a loop, and loops are basically repeated structures. So if I were to say, like if I wanted to repeat hello world 50 times, I only have to write that statement one time, and I could use a loop and say I want to repeat this statement 50 times. And in 3 lines of code, I could get 50 lines that say hello world. So that's where the loops come in. So like in the next bullet point show, it makes the code shorter and efficient. So instead of having like 60 lines of code, I could cut it down to 3 lines of code by just using a loop. And in Python, there are 2 types of loops we are going to mainly be using. And the capstone project will require you to use one of these loops. So the 2 loops we use in Python mainly is the for loop and the while loop. And I'm going to show you the difference between the 2. So next slide. So here's the difference, right? We're going to say for loops versus while loops. So for loops are used when we want to iterate or go through a list of words or a string of characters, right? So if I had a list that said bananas, apples, and pears, right? And then the square brackets. If I want to iterate through each of them and get each of the words, I just have to use the for loop, and I could go through each of the words and then print them at the end. So this will make sense when I go through the demo. I'll show you how it actually works, and I'll show you how it actually prints in the console. We use the for loop when we know exactly how many times the loop we want it to repeat for, right? So we know the exact number of times we want to repeat it 50 times, right? So we just say in Python we use for I in range, and we print 50. Put 50 in, and it'll print 50 times hello world, like in the previous slide we were talking about. So that's when the for loop we use, when we know exactly how many times the loop must be repeated. And the loop can iterate infinite number of times, right? So it could become an infinite loop, which I'm going to explain much more in the later end of this presentation. We're going to talk about infinite loops. But loops can iterate infinite number of times if the condition is not met. So the loop can keep going and going without ever breaking. So that's another thing loops can do. It could become infinite where the code never stops. It will just keep executing forever, infinite number of times. So we use the while loop when we do not know the number of iterations, right? So basically, when we don't know a specific number, we don't know how many times we want this to be repeated, we use the while loop because it's not defined. We don't know. We could be using it maybe 10 times, 20 times, but we don't know the exact number. That's where the while loop becomes more efficient over the for loop. While loops will continue to run infinite number of times until the declared condition is met. So if I were to say while true and print this, it'll keep printing this while the statement is true. It's going to keep repeating it. When the statement becomes false, that's when we'll basically terminate the loop, and your whatever output was there, the last output will print into the console. And I'll show you more of this in PyCharm, so don't get too caught up on it yet, but this will all make sense towards the end of this presentation. And obviously with while loops, complication errors will occur if the condition is not specific, so there could be some complication errors as well with while loops. Alright, so nested loops. So in the previous lesson, we talked about conditionals, and I showed you about nested conditionals. Well, it's similar to what nested conditionals look like. Nested means within each other, right? So what are nested loops? Nested loops are loop blocks inside another loop block, right? Very similar to nested conditionals, right? A loop, a for loop within another for loop, right? And here's the one key catch that I want to really explain clearly, right? And I made it in capital to make sure it becomes more clear. So in a nested loop, we must do all the iterations in the inner loop before we come back and then execute the outer loop again. So we must, once we go into the inner loop, we must run that, if it's showing 5 times, we must run that inner loop 5 times before we come back and execute the outer loop. At this point, it will show you different. If we don't do that, it will be a completely different output, and probably the output will be not correct either. If you didn't have the interpreter, obviously. If we want to just trace it manually and just want to figure out what this output will come out, we have to execute the inner loop before we come back and do the outer loop again. So let me explain that a little more with this diagram right here. So we have 2 for loops, right? Here's the outer loop, right? So we said for row and range, right? And we said, again, range 0 to 1. That means we want to go up to 1, but not including 1, right? So we go 0 pretty much, right? And it stops at 1, but not including it. So this is basically going to run 0, 1 time, right? But here we're going from 1 to 5. So we're pretty much going 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So we'll stop at 4 here. So what I mean by we must do all the iterations in the inner loop before we come back into the outer loop is by this. We must run this 4 times. Once we run this once, we must run this 4 times before we come back out and execute the second iteration. So we must complete all the iterations inside the inner loop first. So we must go iteration 1, then do the second iteration, do the third iteration, do the 4th iteration, and then come back and do whatever was remaining out here. And after we do that, we must go back in and do the same thing. So it could get a little more tricky if the numbers are higher. But in the example, I'm going to show you in PyCharm a much simpler example where how it will print in the console when we execute. Infinite loops. Alright, so like I explained earlier, here's a much more broader scale of what infinite loops are in programming. So just like the name infinite, you heard of infinity probably in a calculus in a math class. Whether it's a simple math, we heard about infinity. We talked about how infinity is just a number that just keeps going on and on. There's no end to it. So that's what pretty much an infinite loop is. An infinite loop is a loop that keeps on executing without ending or terminating, right? So the only way, so how do you terminate an infinite loop? Well, you can't. Well, the interpreter automatically cannot terminate the infinite loop because the computer will keep executing it over and over and over because that's what it is. It's an infinite loop. But the only way we could terminate the infinite loop as a programmer, we need to hit Control-C manually, and it'll just quit the program and it'll just terminate. Other than that, on its own, it will just keep going. So that there's really no way you could end the computer cannot end an infinite loop on its own. You must hit Control-C to end one, because It's just going to keep going if you don't. And here's the example right here of example of an infinite loop. So it says while true, and we know true will always be true, right? This is the condition, true is the condition, true is always going to be true. So this is going to continue forever. So while true, and since true is always going to be true, this is just going to keep executing. So this will go on and on and on. You'll just get a bunch of hello worlds printed into the console that never stop. So that's an infinite loop. And I'll show you that in the PyCharm, which will pretty much look cool actually. You'll see how it looks when we print it in the console. Alright, so getting closer to the end, let's talk about break versus continue. You're gonna see these two words a lot. Break versus continue a lot, right? So break is used when we want to terminate the loop containing it, right? So anytime we have a loop and we just want to break out of it and just return the output, we just write break. So once the interpreter sees the word break, it will just break out of that loop. It will stop executing. It will just return whatever was the last output. So basically it terminates the loop. And break statements can be inserted in nested loops as well. So if you insert it into the inner loop and break out of it, the inner loop will stop, but the outer loop will keep going depending on how the indentation is. But the main part of this is that break basically just terminates the loop. So if you have an infinite loop and you want to just write break at the end, it will hit that and it'll break and it'll just quit the program. So that's another way you can end an infinite loop using the break statement. Continue, however, do not get these two confused. It's very common to get both of these confused. That's why I'm showing a comparison of them. Continue is used when we want to skip the rest of the code inside the loop for the current iteration only. So if I'm on the first iteration and I hit the word continue, I don't want to keep executing. I want to skip the rest of it underneath it. Just go back to the top and execute the next iteration. That's all that continue does. It just, once you hit the continue statement, just go back to the top of the loop and you execute it again. Hit continue, execute it again, right? Continuous statements don't necessarily terminate loops, but they just continue on with the next iteration. So hit continue, go back to the top, continue. Go with the code again, hit continue, go back. So it's pretty much a cycle. It just hits the continue block, goes back to the top, execute, continue, go back to the top, execute. That's pretty much what continue means. So think of it like a circle, just wrapping around. Okay, so that was a lot to digest in one presentation, but here's a good recap of showing you what this whole thing was about. So some of the takeaways from today's lesson is loops are used in programming because it makes a single block of code repeat however many times. It makes the code shorter and efficient, right? So instead of writing 50 lines of code, we could write only 3 lines of code, much shorter, between 50 and 3. Nested loop is a loop inside another loop, right? Similar to how nested conditionals were. Nested loops act the same way. Just do different things, obviously, than nested conditionals, but they execute. Nested always means within each other, so for, and must be indented within each other to make it nested. If they're lined up underneath, the for and the for is underlined up, these are independent, they're not nested. Nested must mean you must indent them, especially in Python. You will have to indent to make it a nested loop. And infinite loops are loops that never terminate unless the programmer does so manually by hitting, Control C. So that's the only way the loops can be terminated is if you hit Control C, or we use this method called break, right? The statement break, and it'll just break out of the loop. So if you guys have any questions, comments, concerns, remember we could always answer your questions when you email us at gencode.us@gmail.com. Make sure you write your questions, make sure what lesson it was, and make sure you write what wasn't clear, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible on that to make it much more understanding. Also, this video is going to be uploaded onto gencode.us, so once you go back and you need some clarifications, you can always go back and watch it again to see if you missed something or you want to clarify something to make it much more clear for you. So that's perfectly fine as well. So that is the end of the presentation. Let me exit the presentation for now, and just like I promised in the beginning, I'm going to show you a little demo in PyCharm for some of these examples to show you. So let's go into PyCharm. right? So let's get this out of the way. Let's show you some answer stuff. So I'm gonna flip between the PyCharm and the presentation to show you some. So let's see. So let's talk about for loops, right? And while loops, right? So again, for loops are like iterating through a list, right? So let's say I have, or a string. So let's say I have a string called hello world. And then I want to say for I in range. This is how you always start a for loop. You'll use the I means iterate in range, right? This is how we write for loops in Python. In Java, it might be different, but this is how we do it in Python. This is how we write for loops in Python. Straightforward. Why in range? Let's see how many characters does this have. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So let's say I in range 12. This will print out the whole stuff, right? And then we'll just say print, and then print s, right? So this will print pretty much the whole string because it goes from 0 to 11. It goes 11 characters, 12. So 11 characters. So we hit 12. So it'll probably print the whole statement. So let's run this PyCharm, and there we go. It printed 12 times, right? See, that's how we iterate, right? We wanted to print hello world 12 times. We printed it 12 times. Let's say I want to print this 50 times, right? So we run it again. And there we go. It printed 50 times. So whatever number you specify here, it'll print it that many times, obviously. So we put 50, right? But again, like I said in Python, always gotta take one number. It goes up to 50, not including. So this actually printed 49 for any clarifications. But if you want to print it 50 times, you just say 51. And that means it'll go from 0 to 51, but not including 51, so it'll print 50. Let's run it again. And there we go. It printed 50 times. If you want to count each of the how many times it printed, it's 50. So again, look, simple, right? We wanted to print hello world 50 times. Simple. 1, 2, 3. 3 lines of code. That's all it took with the loop. Imagine if we had to print this string 50 times manually to say print hello world, make the code much more longer. So this is how the for loop becomes more efficient, right? Makes the code shorter, makes it more efficient. While loops. So let's give a good example of a while loop. So say while true, right? So this is a while loop, but this is also going to be, I'm going to show you how this is going to become an infinite loop as well. So like I showed you in the PowerPoint, we had this example, right? Print hello world, while true, print hello world, right? This is an infinite loop, right? This is never going to end because true, this is the condition. True is the condition, and obviously true is always going to be true, right? True is, it's never going to be false. So as long as this stays true, this will keep printing. So let's run it, and you'll see what I mean by this being infinite in the console. And look, you can see that scroll bar. It just keeps printing and printing. It's never going to end. But there is a method that we could end it, right? I showed you a clear method with the statement break. So if I were to type in break in here, this will break the loop now. So let's run it. This will actually terminate the loop because we're using break. So let me stop and rerun this. And there we go. It only printed hello world once because hello world break the end. So this is, so see, the condition is always going to be true, right? While true is always going to be true. But since we hit this break statement, the break's going to knock us out of this loop, right? It will take us out of the while loop, and it'll just print just this statement, hello world, once. So that's how we terminate a loop. Our infinite loop. We could use the break statement to terminate it. Now, if I use continue, this would be a completely different story, right? Continue will just keep iterating the whole thing over and over again still. Because it's going to go, it acts like an infinite, obviously, for this one. This is just going to continue, keeping. Because what's really saying is, while true, right? Print this, hello world, continue, right? So now you continue, you go back to the top of the loop. While true, print hello world, hit continue, go back to the top of the loop. So again, continue is acting like a circle. It's skipping whatever's, if there was more code underneath, it would never reach that. So if I said print, let's make it clear, print goodbye, right? Right? This is never gonna print goodbye. Print goodbye is never gonna print into this console because this is a continue, right? So once, like I said, when you hit continue, we skip whatever's underneath it. We don't do that. We just go back to the top and do it. And every time we're gonna hit this continue, it's just gonna keep repeating. So it's still gonna repeat hello world. So let me run this again, stop and rerun, and let's see what we get. We're just gonna see. Just keeps going. Just keeps going. So again, continue. This will never happen. This statement, print goodbye, is never gonna print. As long as the word continues there, it's just gonna hit, Python's gonna see continue. Oh, and Python's gonna see, oh, continue. Oh, well, we're just gonna go back to the top and just do it again. While true, print hello world. Let's go down, continue. Oh, okay. Let's skip the rest and just go back to the top. That's all it's saying with continue. Hit the word continue, go back to the top, keep doing it again. Go print hello world, hit continue, go back to the top. You will never get to this statement. It will never reach this statement, print goodbye. That's why it's never getting printed here in the console. It's pretty much an infinite loop with the word continue in it. So, was there anything else I did not mention here? So that pretty much wraps up this presentation, right? I hope you guys found this a little interesting. And again, like I said, if you had any questions, comments, concerns, you can always email us at gencode.us@gmail.com, and we'll get back to you with the answer to your question as soon as possible, right? We want everyone to be clear on this, right? This is a new thing everyone's learning, so it's going to take a little time to digest, but at the end, we're all going to get through it together, and we will all become successful in coding. So, without nothing else to say, I'm going to end the lesson right here, and you could always, again, email us, and we'll answer your questions. So, with that being said, I'm going to sign out, and I'll see you in the next lesson, which will be a little more interesting as well. So, hope you all have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you in our next Python tutorial here at GenCode. Have a good day.